Good afternoon, and thank you for coming out on this very blustery, typically Melbourne winter afternoon. I'm Pete Lentini. I'm the Foundation Director of the Global Terrorism Research Center at Monash. And on behalf of Director Professor Gary Bauma and International Director Professor Greg Barton, I welcome you to today's talk. And today is one of those events where we're really pleased to have someone who is, and this is no hyperbole, one of the leading scholars in this in a number of fields. And I'm very pleased to be able to meet with, finally, after so many years, my colleague, Associate Professor David Cook from the Department of Religious Studies at Rice University. David's one of those rare individuals who's working in our field, who is a scholar of religion. He works very comfortably in Arabic and in Farsi. He's a specialist with significant background in Sunni and Shia traditions. And also for those of us working in terrorism studies, he's written some of the leading stuff on martyrdom and also many of the political and theological traditions of the current movements. Some of his notable books are studies in the Muslim Apocalyptic, which David told me has been banned at Al-Azhar, so we're very pleased to have a copy of that. Let's see, also contemporary Muslim apocalyptic literature, which is published by Syracuse University Press, and the source that probably most of us here are most familiar with is his Understanding Jihad by University of California Press, which is one of the leading books on this topic. It's one of the most academically rigorous in terms of its grounding in theology and politics. So today we're very pleased to have Associate Professor David Cook with us, who's going to talk to us about Islam and the West. David, over to you.
Thank you so much, Pete.
My pleasure.
Okay, well, let's start us off here. Since I'm going to be speaking on Islam in the West, I guess 2 hours should definitely be enough for a thorough treatment of the subject, right? No, that's obviously highly unrealistic. And I'm a professor of religious studies. And so as I'm starting off this lecture, I think that it's important to remember that. When I mention that to U.S. intelligence or military people, they try and ignore it and speak about it sort of like in undertones. But I think that it's important to start off with the fact of the religion. And this is, again, a painful issue because the natural tendency of most of you, no doubt, is to look at this issue in strictly quantifiable terms and not to look at it in the way that religious studies professor would look at it, which, as I say, is looking at the religious aspect. And so I'm going to do something that's going to make you feel uncomfortable, and we are going to start talking about some of the basic religious issues here. This is not an interfaith dialogue, feel-good sort of thing. We want to talk about some major issues that come up from that. And we start off with the Quran. I don't think that it's possible to discuss religious issues, Islam in the West, whatever those two terms actually mean, and I have to admit that I have a little bit of a problem with that, but whatever those two terms mean without starting off with the Quran and the conception of personality and of history that is involved inside the Quran. Now, I teach a course on the Quran, and coming from a Christian background myself, I have to admit that I constantly look at the differences between the two books, the Bible and the Quran. I'd like to start off this lecture actually by highlighting a couple of them and how they have a great number of ramifications for the relations that we're talking about right here. The first one that I'd like to point out is that the Quran presents history in a certain manner. Okay, that history is presented in a manner that is moralistic in nature. In other words, history is devolved down into a series of moral lessons. each particular prophetic experience is given not with specificity regarding a group of events, but with regard to the moral lessons that can be drawn from them. Now, this is quite different from the biblical approach, and it's important to understand when we're talking about the differences between Islam and whatever the West is, and again, I have problems with that term, but that conceptually we are starting off with different approaches to the same material. In other words, the stories and the sort of religious aspects that are described inside the Quran and the Bible are basically the same material. But their approach towards it is quite different. First of all, we have that moralistic aspect, okay? Second of all, I would like to point out that, that there is a certain sacrality about personality and authority inside the Quran that is lacking inside the Bible. Here, I'd like to highlight a certain story that exists in both the Quran and the Bible, and it's one that some of you may be familiar with from church or mosque or whatever. The story of King David and his repossession of his officer Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. Okay, a classic example inside the Bible of an abuse of power, in which the prophet Samuel basically comes to King David and says, "You stole somebody else's wife," and forces King David into an attitude of submission. Okay, now the closest parallel that we get inside Islam to this is the tradition in the Jihad literature that's known as a word of truth that is spoken in the face of a tyrannical ruler, in which jihad is justified. In other words, to bring into control a certain tyrannical ruler. But there is always the attitude that there are certain figures, prophetic figures usually, that are outside of the boundaries. In other words, these people are protected by their sacral authority, okay? And so when we look at the story of King David inside the Quran, it's not surprising what we see is that self-same story mentioned, except for David doesn't actually steal the wife. And there's no real confrontation between the prophet and David. It's not precisely the same. So we have a difference right there. We have this attitude on the part of Muslims vis-a-vis the biblical tradition that there is there's a non-critical attitude towards certain figures that are simply off bounds. And I think that when we start off talking about Islam in the West, we have to start off with that particular fact, okay? Because it's a recurring fact that we're continually seeing in cultural confrontations between Muslims and Westerners. Okay, the tradition that is rooted inside the Bible and also of inside Roman tradition as well, of confrontation of the ruler, of checking the ruler usually through law, versus the sacral authority that surrounds prophets and ultimately then those who are descended from prophets, rulers inside the Muslim world. Now, let's continue on with some other different major issues. The one that I'd like to highlight next has to do with power. Okay, now I grew up studying Middle Eastern studies under the influence of Said. And one can speak about good things and bad things with regard to Said. But I definitely do view the Middle Eastern history in ways that are different, let's say, than Said. Is that we do have an attitude of dominance versus domination that continually runs through the relationship between whatever Islam is and whatever the West is. At certain times during history, There was a sense that one side was more powerful, one side had cultural and religious domination, it had prestige and so forth, and usually that was actually tied to economic and cultural factors. Now, there's a very strong perception that that role reversal has happened during the last 200 years. And so that leads to an attitude of continually expressing the other as other, okay? That other has changed, that other has become what was previously a dominated factor, has now become a dominating one. And how one deals with that, you can go back to Said talking about problems that are coming out of that. A byproduct of that power issue has to do with the concept of historical consciousness. Now, this is something that my students oftentimes don't understand. They say, well, we're conscious of history. I actually don't think that Americans are very conscious of history at all. And it may be true that Australians aren't either. Although I'm not sure that I could say that this audience is very much Australian, since at least half of you are from outside. But there's a very strong sense within the Muslim world of historical consciousness. And I give you true to my own nature, I love books. And so when I go to an Arabic bookstore, I think, isn't this such an amazing experience that one can buy an entire library of classical materials that is still being used by the population? How many of you can say that? If you go down to the local bookstore here in Monash, can we still find copies of Piers Plowman or the Canterbury Tales that are actually being read and interested in by the students instead of being forced upon them by their teachers? But I can do that in the Muslim world. I can do that throughout the Arabic-speaking world. There's a strong historical consciousness that goes all the way back to the time of the prophets and even earlier, that is entirely lacking in today's whatever the West is. I guess I have to constantly deal with that question about how to define the West. So maybe later on in the lecture, I'll be drug kicking and screaming into actually confronting it. But surely Said will have a factor in that as well. So the cognizance of history is something that is major difference between whatever Islam in the West is. That sense that one can speak about the Battle of Poitiers in 732, for example, in the south of France when the Muslims are checked. If you ask a Frenchman, maybe they won't even know what this is. It certainly has no more relevance to them than the battles of Julius Caesar in 40 before Christ. So the relevance of history is huge. And it differs considerably when one side has a strong sense of a historical grasp that the other side simply lacks entirely. The question of responsibility vis-a-vis history is huge in dealing with Islam in the West as well. The sense of what exactly is someone's responsibility vis-a-vis their own history and how that reflects into power politics. Today, we're watching that with regard to Syria, where in the United States, there's a continual debate. What exactly is the United States' responsibility vis-a-vis Syria? And one can quantify that on a number of different levels. You can ask the question, were we colonially involved with Syria? No. Were we historically involved with Syria? Can anybody answer that question? The United States? Anybody know? Nope, nobody knows? Okay, yeah. So actually, yes, the United States was culturally involved with Syria. We helped found the first university in the area, the American University of Beirut. Syrian American Protestant missionaries were very, very active in the creation of what today we call Syrian nationalism. So there is a connection. It's deep. Not a single American would ever remember it. No one if I was giving this class in the United States, would have any idea that there's any connection historically between the United States and Syria. So we can speak about it. Do we have any responsibility there? Is there a responsibility to defend against genocide, so forth? What is exactly responsibility as far as power in this question? And the third point that I'd like to bring out about power has to do with conversion. Again, this is so painful. Militaries hate it when I bring this up, you know, speaking about conversion and so forth. But the point of a conversionary religion is to convert. And Islam is a conversionary religion. Its basic goal is to convert everyone, or everyone that is possible, everyone that has been willed by God to convert to Islam. And so the question of what exactly is the power relationship there, because ultimately conversion is a reflection of power. It's a reflection of who has the power. Now, of course, my dad, who's a theologian, wouldn't say it quite like that. He would say, well, no, it's one who has to accept Jesus Christ, or accept that there is only one God, and Muhammad is his messenger, and so forth. But as I look at it, you know, with a little bit more of a skeptical eye, what I see as I travel through Africa, as I travel through Asia, is essentially what we're getting right there is you're converting to a civilization that equals power. It so delighted me to hear that there's someone here from Nigeria. When I travel in Nigeria, I notice there's a couple of things. When you go to an internet cafe, you find that everybody in it is a Christian. It's so funny. They're always controlled by Christians. I'm sure that none of you think of the internet as being a Christian sort of thing. But within the context of West Africa, it oftentimes is. Then when you go to a money changer in Nigeria, they're invariably Muslim. They're always Muslim, you think. Can I please find a Christian money changer? No, there isn't any such thing. You have power right there. It's culture. Okay, when you convert to Christianity, essentially what you're saying in a context like that is you're converting to the West. When you're converting to Islam in a place like that, you're saying you're converting to history. Because history in Nigeria is essentially dominated by Muslims. Conversion, it's very powerful. It's very powerful, and a lot of people want to ignore it. But the conversion process is one that is extremely important. People ask, you know, things like, when do people turn into radicals? How do they turn? Why do people convert? Why are we watching the widow of one of the Boston bombers, her head covered with a hijab, and juxtaposed next to her are all these pictures from her high school years where she looks considerably different? What happened to her? How did she make that transition? Was it just because of marriage? Was she radicalized? Did she really believe? Where was the power going? Okay, now let's go to kind of a little bit more of a friendly discussion. And that's the interlinkages. The interlinkages between the Muslims, the Muslim world and the West are huge. And this is comfortable for us to talk about, because this is the future that we want to see. We don't want to see, you know, Salafi imams telling us about al-wala wal-bara, you know, why Christians and Jews are so horrible and so forth, and why we shouldn't have anything to do with those Muslims that associate with Westerners and so forth. We want to talk about the assimilation process. And the assimilation process is basically focused upon minorities. Muslim minorities in the West. For some of you who are under the age of 30, to you it might seem extremely natural that there are Muslim minorities. I'm 46, so it's just barely natural for me. Those of you who are older than me probably would remember those times where it's extremely unnatural. and realize that what we're watching right here is a huge social transformation, which can be compared to others, but the jury is still out, in my opinion, as to whether it's going to be a success. Now, it takes a number of different forms. And those forms are obviously well known to you. Coming from the United States, obviously I love the American way. American way divides people up, forces them into Americanism. They are seduced gradually. Their parents remain angry. The second generation is usually happy, successful. The third generation is mostly indifferent, and oftentimes then loses its religion. I can also watch other models happening. Models in Europe, which we can talk about at a later time. Those models are oftentimes characterized as failures because the populations resist any forms of assimilation. Instead, what we have is a parent society that oftentimes demonizes, oftentimes denigrates, and sometimes even persecutes the minority group. Now, the question of who is responsible in a situation like that is always a painful one, because the parent society can obviously say, well, we were here first, and we don't have a responsibility to assimilate. Why should we assimilate? Yes, so all those foreign foods, they just taste horrible, and why do we have to hear muezzins and women with hijabs and all sorts of stuff like that? So those are questions that are not easily answered. They are not easily answered because one could place themselves in a judgmental position and say, well, you should assimilate. It's better for the community. On the other hand, who are we to judge? Said would have said that. So we have problems like that. Major, major problems of minorities. Now, I can't be quite as sanguine as somebody like Tariq Ramadan, who says that Islam in Europe is a gift. But I can say that I am actually hopeful for the future. I wouldn't say that I necessarily believe that there's some sort of inevitability of conflict, but I do believe that there is a strong possibility of certain elements that either cannot, will not assimilate in any form and seek in some way or another to instead assimilate the parent society. I wrote my dissertation on the Umayyads. How many of us here have heard of the Umayyads? Wow, we got two. Okay, so the Umayyads were the first major Arab dynasty. But the question that I asked in my dissertation was, how is it that the Muslim invasions of the classical worlds were the only ones that didn't get assimilated by their societies that they invaded? All the other societies did get assimilated. The Visigoths eventually turned Christian. Vandals did too, kicking and screaming. Germans, you got all these different societies that eventually assimilate, but the Muslims never did. As a matter of fact, they converted everybody around them to Islam eventually. So this is a very open historical question, and of course Europeans may be not familiar with this, but it's a question that in my opinion has some amount of relevance for today. The question in certain elements of the Muslim community going in that direction, seeking to replicate that particular historical occurrence. And that I don't know. Second point has to do with cultural issues. These are pretty dear to my heart. And they touch upon things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion, which to me are two things that are basically irreducible norms. About a month and a half ago, I was lecturing in Iran, and I was at a university, and somebody threw the inevitable question at me. Do you support the burnings of Qurans by the American pastor Terry Jones? Oh, this is a painful question on so many different levels. Because, I mean, personally, you know, I think that Terry Jones is a total loon. But, you know, as an American, I have to support that he has the right to burn the Qurans. On the third hand, I'm a bookophile, and I really, 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 really hate burning books under any circumstances. And on the fourth hand, may God help me if I understand what he's trying to do except for provoke a religious war or become a martyr. But on the fifth hand, I've still got to support him because he's doing things that are under the freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So, yeah, trying to boil that down to an Iranian audience wasn't the most pleasant event in my life. And needless to say, I entertained about an hour or two of questions about it. But I still believe it. And I still think that those things, those interdependencies, are actually created by what I hope will be over a long period of time of assimilation of the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Now, these are two things, again, that do come back to those initial Quranic issues that I was talking about at the beginning of this lecture. Okay, nobody wants to notice them, but they're perfectly there. So the Imam immediately said to me, he said that no prophets should be insulted. I've got a major problem with that. I've got a major, major problem with that. And again, that's coming out of the biblical tradition, where the tradition of mockery of major figures, major religious figures, major political figures is really common and upheld by all of us. I was reading your selection of Bush quotes outside of your office right there, and it's mirrored by a number of different things that I've seen on different doors directed at major political figures, but also religious figures as well. The Pope is not immune, nor is Jesus. Why should Muhammad be? Are we making Muhammad immune? And that's a painful question. Because on the one hand, you could say, if I want to make sure that people are assimilated, I should be as polite as possible. And that's what I feel with regard to the Quran. I have 20-some Qurans. To date, I've always resisted the temptation to put one under my foot and wiggle it around a little bit. I treat them with respect. But it's a very open question about to what degree that leads inexorably into some sort of intimidation. Because I also receive some amount of threats about issues like that as well. And those threats make me feel like maybe I should go out and burn a Quran. But I can't bring myself to do something like that because I love books. And I really don't actually want to start a religious war. So these are very open questions. And they're questions that all of us have to meditate about as we're talking about these interlinkages. A third issue is one that just comes up because I love to travel as well, which comes back to Said, and that's the question of othering. Othering for me means tourism. I love to travel in the Muslim world. And I love to watch Westerners as they travel in the Western world, in the Muslim world too. Some of them are very watchable. Some of them don't have very much on. And so the question here is, to what degree are our contacts between different groups and civilizations, to what degree do they create this sense of interdependency? What do we learn? Can we go through Egypt, for example, and simply not see the Egyptians? First time I took a tour in Egypt in 1985, I was amazed at how you could do that. The guide never mentioned anything about Egyptians. You know, as if we were living entirely in the Pharaonic period. You know, I asked a question about Baybars al-Bundakdari, who was a famous Mamluk ruler, and the guy had said, "Where did you hear that name?" You know, as if I was saying something so subversive within the context of Egypt, where this is a major ruler who ruled between 1260 and 1277 and actually founded the Mamluk system inside Egypt. And maybe he's even a little bit more relevant than Pharaoh Ramses II, perhaps. But who goes to Egypt to see Baybars al-Bundakdari? Who even knows his name? Tourism. It's a major problem in the issue of othering. Okay, so let's go on to the issue of radicalism, which I'm sure is probably the reason why you came to this lecture. So I won't deny you my own feelings about radicalism. You know, sometimes I actually resist trying to talk about radicalism just because it does get talked about so much since September 11th. But yeah, it's useless to fight against that. To me, radicalism is a development that comes in the question of authority. And again, this comes down to how I see Islam in the contemporary world. And here I speak mainly about Sunnism, because the issue of authority in Shiism is quite different. Shiites do have authority. So their hierarchical structure is actually quite similar to that of the Roman Catholic Church. But Sunnism is considerably lacking in authority. And radicalism as a phenomenon, as a social phenomenon, as a religious phenomenon, is basically one that is coming to redefine that. And it also helps us with the issue of history. Okay, I don't know that I believe or accept the different paradigms that we see today in the market about radicals being the new Protestants. But I will say that we have a couple of interesting parallels right there. So Protestantism rises with a major transformation in technology. The major transformation is the printing press. What major transformation do we have here? It's the development of the internet. Radicalism, like Protestantism, is very, very closely connected to that technology and flows very easily with it. It's amazing for me that only 10, 12 years ago, I was reading articles in journals on Islam that stated categorically that Muslims weren't even a major presence on the internet. I see that's causing some hilarity today. You can trust me that if you wanted to look at them, you can find them in Judeo-Islamica or Arabica and so forth. Yes, that's changed quite significantly. And we can say that that really radicals have been the driving force behind that. The question of definition of boundaries. Again, an authority-based issue that has its roots also within power and history as well, is huge for Sunnis. Why would that be huge? Sunnism is a majoritarian religion. It flourishes as a majority and traditionally didn't really create boundaries because it didn't need to. It was always in charge. And so what we're watching is gradually, under the influence of radicalism, actually certain elements of Sunnism are beginning to take things that are more closely associated with Shiism traditionally and to use them. Okay, a case in point is the doctrine that I just finished listing, a wala wal bara. Okay, this is a polarizing doctrine that basically, in its most simplified form, speaks about anything that is positive, love for Islam as being good and necessary, and those things that are against Islam, they're negative, okay? And so each element of is divided into essentially a black and white categorization on that basis. Now one has to understand that this wala wal bara is more or less an internal issue. And that the first times that we read about it inside Muslim history are actually coming from Shiite history. Why would that be the case? Because Shiites were the ones who were persecuted. They were the ones who had to outwardly say, we believe in the Abbasids and so forth, all the while cursing them inside their hearts. These sort of things are increasingly adopted by Sunni radicals in order to, we can say, even infiltrate their system, in order to create boundaries. Their emphasis upon the issue of creed, okay, historically, something that was almost irrelevant for Sunnis. Sunnism flourished as an orthopraxy. Didn't matter where exactly one believed, mattered whether you went to your 5 prayers. You can read that inside the documents repeatedly. That was even almost a synonym for the word Muslim, as somebody who prayed the 5 prayers. Today, under the influence of radicalism, the issue of creed has become huge. Why is that the case? Because one has to establish boundaries within the contemporary world. One has to create those boundaries and make sure to police them. How does one police them? Through what we can essentially call vigilantism. A couple of years ago, I had a Muslim student in one of my classes. She was the vice president of the Muslim Students Association. And at Rice University, we usually, the professors oftentimes dine with the students. So one Ramadan, happened to be doing that, and came across Aliyah with a plate of food. And she turned so red, she almost dropped her food. I guess she had banked on the fact that going to a school like Rice University, that there wouldn't be anybody else inside the student mess halls who would actually know it was Ramadan and who would care, except for she ran into me. And of course, you know, I mean, I will say I didn't say anything, but she never took any of my classes again. And she always avoided me from then on. Did I shame her into actually keeping Ramadan? Probably not. Probably not. But that was entirely inadvertent under any circumstances. But it's easy to see how another Muslim in that situation could have, because she knew she was doing something. Oops, she's the vice president of this Muslim Students Association, and she's chowing it down in the middle of the day on Ramadan, and she's not pregnant, and she's not traveling, etc. Oops. Protestantism with regard to the religion. Okay, once again, an anti-historical attitude. How are you supposed to deal with history if you're a contemporary radical? You know, I read the works of Abu Musab al-Suri, whose name, ironically, just finished cropping up yet again with regard to the Boston bombers, astonishingly enough. There's an interesting little point there where he talks about how I was reading together with one of my students the section where he critiques the various different jihadi groups. And he talks about speaking with various different figures, and he happened to casually say, after the name of a Nanawi, it's a major commentator on the Muslim figure Muslim, who wrote one of the major collections of hadith, and he said after his name, Rahimahullah, may God have mercy on him. And his Salafi companion said, don't say that, he wasn't a Muslim. That's a very interesting comment. Nawawi is, I mean, he's a major historical figure. And if you could say something like that, then you'd be forced to say, who exactly in the pre-modern period was a Muslim if Nawawi wasn't a Muslim? That's like saying, I don't know, St. Augustine wasn't a Christian. What are you supposed to do with that? So you have within you this strong tendency, this strong ahistorical tendency to pretend that history just simply didn't exist if you're a Salafi, if you're a radical. Because you have to. Now, why is that so useful to say that somebody is some major figure like Nawawi wasn't a Muslim? Because then you can begin to ignore the huge mass of Sharia that you have to deal with. This comes back to the issue of the authority question. Who has the authority? For a traditional Muslim, it has to be the ulama. It has to be the religious hierarchy. But uniformly, this group is hostile to radicalism. As a matter of fact, to me, to my eyes, the most obvious way to inoculate a Muslim from radicalism is actually just to put them in a religious school and make them learn the traditional way. Because in actuality, that forces you into a world, a conceptual world, that is quite distant from radicalism and doesn't allow you actually to go into it very well. So, just by saying that Nawawi wasn't a Muslim, you're all of a sudden avoiding that particular issue. You're able to pretend that Muslim history didn't exist and that maybe it started with our friend Sayyid Qutb instead of with Muhammad. So you go back to Muhammad, you go back to the Prophet, and you look not at the hadith literature, the tradition literature, but you look at the life of the Prophet. How did he live, actually? This is what's known as the fiqh as-sirah, the jurisprudence of the Prophet Muhammad's life, in which you don't pay attention to the huge conservative force of the Sharia with all of its endless legal discussions and so forth that you will never, ever get out of in a lifetime. But if you just go to the life of the Prophet, then you can have a life that's an exemplary life. Now, if you look at that life, however, you have two choices. Two choices that are the two different sides of the Prophet's life. One is that of a missionary, one of them is political figure. And you have to make a choice about what type of Islam you're talking about right there, the Meccan type or the Medinan type. So another aspect of that loss of authority is reflected in the questions of fatwas. Now, contemporary Arabs speak about this as the chaos of fatwas. And I tend to agree with it. It's an amazing experience to go into this world, if only just because from a social point of view, basically what you're looking at is twofold things. One of them is Islam in action. In other words, it's Islam as the rubber hits the road. It's actually the problems that people face in dealing with the contemporary world. The second thing that you're looking at is the attempts by various different scholars to continually augment their personal and spiritual authority, which can only today be accomplished by either being a media personality or by issuing massive numbers of fatwas. Now, the fact that some of these fatwas are contradictory or that some of them are being forced to give opinions about subjects about which they know nothing leads to a huge number of ridiculous things. You can go to websites today that detail things like the top 100 most incredibly stupid fatwas, and some of them are very, very amusing. But that does not answer the question about authority. How is authority created? Today, it's created essentially through that augmentation of spiritual authority of the fatwa. Now, gradually, what we're watching during the last 5 years is that Arab authorities are beginning to put an end to that. First, Saudi Arabia, and then several other different Arab countries have now issued injunctions against actual issuing of fatwas outside of governmental protocols. Now, I won't say that I really believe that this is actually going to stop that issue. But I will say that it may be a direction in which something might be accomplished. But ultimately, that's essentially just putting a Band-Aid on the issue. Because the issue still comes back to the question of who has the authority. Okay, so in classical Islam, we can speak about a couple of different sources of authority. One of them is a genealogical type of authority, where somebody can be descended from the Prophet Muhammad and can have authority because of that. Okay, one is an authority, or second is an authority of knowledge. Those people that are ulama, they acquire their authority through their vast learning and their command of the traditional sources. We can also speak about an authority of fighting for Islam, or some sort of a perception that you're defending Islam. Okay, that generates authority, which we can call even practical authority. Today, we see oftentimes a conflict between that sense of authority and the knowledge-based authority, which is best exemplified, in my opinion, by the conflict between Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the leader of the late leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and his mentor, Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi. Abu Muhammad, a man of the pen, took to noticing the extreme barbarism to which Abu Musab al-Zarqawi had descended, began to remonstrate with him. Zarqawi's response was, "You aren't in the field. You don't have the right to tell me what to do." In other words, the jihad fighter has the right to create law and authority. Now, the problem with that is essentially where Zarqawi is today and where Abu Muhammad is today. And it's easy to see. The fact is that Abu Musab, whatever you can say about his methodology, had lost all perspective and had simply was not able to see what Abu Muhammad was able to see, that his actions, no matter how justified they could be according to Muslim law, had simply detracted completely from his message. It was no longer tenable to hold to what he was holding. So there's different types of authority. There's other different types of authority. I'm not going to specify all of them, but those are the key ones that we have that we can speak about. Okay, and all of those have relevance with regard to contemporary Islam. Okay, note that that those countries that have not been touched by the Arab Spring, and they're few and far between nowadays. So who are they? Those people that have that authority of genealogy. Who would have thunk it? You know, Nasser would be rolling in his grave to realize that his old enemies, the Hashemites in Jordan, and the kingdom in Morocco, and the kingdom in Saudi Arabia, those were the ones who managed to survive the Arab Spring. Makes you feel like there's no justice in the world, doesn't it? But the revolutionary regimes fell like ninepins, didn't they? Yep, Gaddafi and descendants of Nasser, and now poor Assad in Syria. Yep, they're all fallen. So those people that have the authority, those are the ones that actually managed to survive. Really. So what we have here is essentially the creation of a new, in the words of Olivier Roy, a new ummah, a new community. It's a community that is actually much smaller than the numerical strength of the Muslim community as an outsider would perceive it. Here I'll just digress briefly because sometimes people ask me, how many Muslims are there? I hate that question because how on earth can anybody answer it? It really depends upon how you define what the word Muslim is. You know, are all people that are considered to be marginal Muslims or and so forth, are they Muslims and everything? So what we're getting right here is by radicals, we have a redefinition of the ummah, a cutting out of marginal Muslims, and a continued and concerted hostility towards what hitherto has been the major bulwark of the Muslim community, which are Sufis. And it is not at all difficult to see the reasons why. Not at all. Sufism represents the conversionary aspect of Islam. It represents the aspect of Islam that speaks beyond the boundaries of Islam. From a historical point of view, obviously we can find people that were Sufis that weren't even Muslims. Okay, Jews, Christians, and even Hindus practiced Sufism that were not Muslims. And this is the aspect of Sufism that comes back to bite it today. It's that sense that Sufis don't really need Islam. Now, of course, from a historical point of view and a personal point of view, that's ridiculous for the vast majority of Sufis. The vast majority of Sufis are perfectly good Muslims. I'll go out on a limb as a religious studies scholar and say that, even though I don't usually judge who is Muslim and who is not. But the fact is that if I were to say anything different, I'd simply have to say that there weren't any Muslims at all. But for radicals, that has to be different. In other words, those precise groups that are going to go beyond the boundaries of Islam, those are the ones that are going to receive the major attacks. And Sufism is the most obvious one. So it's continued movement towards the creation of a smaller, more cohesive, more Protestant group is fairly obvious. Now, within those imperatives, it's very obvious also the missionization process. Okay, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, the purpose of a missionizing religion is to missionize. It's to convert. And the fact is that that is still a major factor. Nowhere clearer than in Salafism. Now, the point is, or the problem with Salafism as far as missionization goes, is that getting rid of Sufism forces people into a black and white attitude towards Islam as a whole, okay, which wasn't necessarily true of Sufism. Okay, and that's essentially the thing that is the problem with conversion on that angle. It's the reason why well over 90% of converts are going to the Sufis rather than the Salafis. So it's just too much of a stark difference, whereas Sufis are warm and inviting and gradual, and they're bringing people into Islam. Salafism requires an absolute break, you know, sometimes even a break with one's family, friends, and so forth, an absolutism that is simply too stark for most people. Okay, now let's transition a little bit and come closer to a close to the issues of response. And again, these are very open. These are very open. What we're watching today in Europe primarily is the rise of a number of different hostile responses towards Islam. And I think that needs to be said absolutely. I personally don't see it as an actual persecution of Muslims, but definitely attempts on a number of different levels to make sure that Muslims know that they aren't welcome. And these things include things like the Swiss ban on minarets of a couple of years ago, various different moves against the hijab, but most especially the rise of anti-immigrant political parties. Now, these anti-immigrant political parties flourish because of ambiguity. They're able to define themselves as opposed to immigrants, but the real fact is that they're opposed to Muslim immigrants. And this is illustrated by the fact that certain groups who are historically anti-Muslim have been perfectly welcome to join these types of parties. And you can see that in the UK, especially. A second factor has to do with aggressive polemics. I have to again fall back on my own history here, because growing up in a conservative Christian background, Islam was very peripheral. One cannot say that it is peripheral today. One can say that just like with the Salafism, there is a major effort to polemicize. And here I'm not speaking necessarily with regard to actual conversion, but there's an effort to seek out certain issues that get to Muslims. Again, I do not believe necessarily that that highlighting these particular issues actually leads to any form of conversion. It may, but I don't think that in most cases it does. But what it is a much more aggressive attitude towards Muslims inside Western world and inside Africa. Africa is really one of the major areas where you find this type of aggressive proselytization and targeting of Muslims. Now, on the other hand, we also see some movement towards assimilation. This is easiest for me to note with regard to the United States. Now, we have two Muslim representatives in the Congress of the United States, which I consider to be a very interesting and positive move. Both of them are very obviously converts, Keith Ellison and Andre Carson. And a much more of a normalization of the presence of Islam inside the political and social sphere. Now, I can't speak about Europe, because honestly, that would be a totally different issue. But definitely within the United States, we're watching during the last 10 years, the opposite of what I would have thought would have been the normal process after September 11th, which is actually the political prominence of Muslims, not of Islam, but of Muslims within the political sphere. It may be that in 10, 20, 30 years, maybe there will even be a viable Muslim candidate for presidency inside the United States. A couple of years ago, when President Obama was elected, there's obviously been numerous conspiracy theories on the internet. You know, he's Muslim. I have to admit, visiting my parents in the home where they're living, I was surrounded by their friends, who really very strongly wanted me to say, Obama is a Muslim. Like, he's not a Muslim, guys. It isn't happening. It's not where it goes. But I would say that actually there's a very strong possibility that there could be a viable Muslim candidate within a number of years. I think that is basically where the trajectory is going inside the United States. Outside of it, I'm not going to comment. So the things that we're watching with regard to social trends are very much the loss of youth among Muslims. And this is something that's very painful for Muslims to admit, okay, because they want to admit or to believe that assimilation is going to lead to the keeping of their youth of the second and third generation. Now, watching this youth pass through Rice and so forth and other different schools, you see actually the opposite. It's very much that Muslim youth are not substantially different from Christian or Jewish or other religious groups of this particular generation, is that more and more are declaring themselves to be non-religious and so forth. The overall trend is definitely towards non-affiliation. Now, the secondary manifestation of that I see is very much of an avoidance on the part of those people who are Muslim of any form of differentiation between Muslims. In other words, they don't want to be called Sunni Shiites. This is, again, very strikingly similar to the sort of trends that you see among devout Christians. They don't want to be Methodists, Baptists, and so forth. They want to be just Christians. Muslims are very similar in that case. Okay, but a substantial section of the population that's going through the educational system essentially is coming out without religion. And so this is definitely a movement in one direction. Okay, inside Islam, in my experience, it is a much more stark process than you find, for example, in Christianity. Okay, I'll just give you one of my closest friends. It's a Muslim guy, Pakistani heritage and so forth. One day his parents came home, found a note from his younger brother on the table, and just said, I don't want it anymore. I don't want to be a Pakistani. I don't want to be a Muslim. I just want to be an American. Don't look for me. You won't ever find me. Have a nice life. Stuff like that. It's very stark. You know, very, very stark. And maybe under the circumstances, given the punishment for apostasy and so forth, it's understandable the reasons why that sort of starkness appears. The other two issues have to do with conversion and interfaith dialogue. Converts are increasingly a major factor. Now, converts can take many different forms. There's those people who, ridiculously enough, do actually convert to something of what I call a caricature of Islam. In other words, they believe that Islam is violent because everybody says it on the media, and so they convert to Islam and think, wow, you know, let's go out and fire a bunch of guns. Those are interesting to read about on the news. I'm glad that I don't have to come into personal contact with them. There's a huge number of marriage converts. Okay, and these can't help but change Islam because of the injection of Western norms. Okay, most of the marriage converts tend to be female. They're the ones that are essentially raising the next Muslim generation. They've converted to Islam. The question remains a very open one: to what Islam have they converted? And what type of Islam will they pass to the next generation? The last issue has to do with interfaith dialogue. I'm very skeptical about interfaith dialogue, to be absolutely blunt. I really don't know whether I see its utility, actually, since I'm very grimly aware of the theological differences between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. I'm not really sure what the point of hashing them out in public repeatedly is, actually. But having said that, there's some very positive notes that you can see. Probably the most positive one is the document known as the Common Word document, which came out after the Danish cartoon issue in 2007, 2008, and does call for what I would say is probably about as close as you're going to get to some sort of a balanced issue between Islam and the West. With that, I'd like to actually bring this lecture to a conclusion and open you up for questions, but I'll just say a few last summary words. Obviously, Islam in the West is a subject that's way too vast for a single lecture, but I think that it's one that is important for us to hash out on a university level without being excessively delicate about the major issues. I think that it's important to deal with the major. That's one of the reasons why I have problems with interfaith dialogue, because I feel like it's just too too delicate, but I think that it's important to deal with these issues and to discuss them, since obviously you as the next generation are going to have to deal with these issues. And some of them will change, some of them will modify, but many of them will almost certainly remain markedly the same. So with that, I'd like to conclude